Hello everyone and welcome to .NET Core Central. In my last video, I started discussing about GraphQL and mainly I discussed about how to query using GraphQL. In today's video, I'm going to talk about how to do data modification, meaning updating of data using GraphQL, and then I'm going to walk through how we can use a GraphQL client to do query as well as post functionality in the GraphQL server. The data manipulation functionality, which can be considered in the REST world as post, put, or delete, when we do that in GraphQL, it is called mutation. So let's start with that. But before I do that, I would suggest you go through my previous video because most of the thing that I am doing here is starting from where I left in my previous video. But just to give a high-level rundown, in my previous video, I created a type called product, and then a GraphQL type for that, and then a query object which does the actual query, and then finally a schema where we added the schema for the query. And I had a product provider which I moved it to a separate class for simplicity, and the product provider was just returning some in-memory products. And then finally in program, after adding all the classes to dependency injection container, I used the add GraphQL extension method to add the GraphQL to dependency injection. And then finally, I used the use GraphQL with the schema to add the GraphQL middleware and use GraphQL Altair to add the middleware for Altair, which is a web-based user interface for executing GraphQL. So I'm going to quickly run this code and just query existing products to show you. And then we'll go and implement the mutation for GraphQL. So once the project is loaded, we can go to UI/Altair to show up the Altair screen. And here we have the documentation tab where we can look into the individual documentation. This is also something I covered in my last video. And then we can execute a query. If we want to select a particular product, we can execute this query. If we want to select all the product, we can execute a query like this. If we want to get rid of some properties, we can just get rid of, and the response will come back with exactly what we need. And that is the main advantage of GraphQL, which I discussed in my previous video. Now let's get back and start adding the mutation implementation. So before we get into mutation, for supporting mutation, the product cannot be like this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a class and I'm going to call it as data access. And all I'm going to do is I'm just going to create an in-memory data store. And for the data access class, I'm going to have a private read-only list. And here what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy paste this and paste it here. So these are the product definition. This is the product definition, and then I'm going to create a method to return the product. So public list of product, and I'm going to name it as get, and it is going to return the products. And then I'll also create a method to create product. So I'm going to name it as public void create, and it is going to take product as a parameter. And here I'm just going to do products.add product. Product is the in-memory list. So that's all. And then I'm just going to implement an interface or extract an interface out of this class and put it in the same class just for simplicity. Okay. And I can get rid of these unnecessary pieces. Okay, so this is ready. And then what I can do is for the product provider, I can create a constructor where I'm going to take I data access. And here I can just do data access dot get dot toArray. So this will be my product provider. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add the data access into the dependency injection. I'm going to quickly run this and make sure it's working. And then we are going to go and create a method for creating product. So let me run this, and this is working as expected. Now we'll go ahead and implement, just like iProductProvider, we're going to create iProductCreator. So let's go ahead, create a new class, name it as Product Creator, and let me get rid of this. And for the product creator, what we are going to do is we are going to, just like the product provider, we'll have a constructor, and in the constructor we'll take iDataAccess, and then we'll create a public product create, which is going to take product as a parameter. And here we're going to return product, and then before that what we'll do is we'll do data access dot create product. So all we are going to do, it's simple, it's just going to append the data to the in-memory data store. That's all it is doing. And then now it's time to create product mutation. So in the product class we have the product type and product query. For mutation, let's create a new class, and I'm going to name it as product mutation, and I'm going to have the product mutation implementation later on. But before that, just like when we return a type in GraphQL, we have to create a GraphQL type. Similarly, we have to create a type for input parameters. So we cannot just accept the product itself, but we'll expect an input parameter which will derive from input object graph type. So for that, I'm going to create a public class, and I'm going to say product input, and it is going to derive from input object graph type. And just like if you remember the product type in the constructor, we were using field, we are going to do the similar thing here. So we'll create a constructor. In the constructor, we're going to create a field, and the type of the field is going to be int graph type. If you remember, graph type has their own integer and string and other value. The first one will be ID, and then second one will be string graph type, which will be the name. Third one again will be int graph type, which will be quantity. These are the, if you remember, these are the three parameters we have: ID, name, and quantity. Hence ID, name, and quantity here. And then we're going to implement the product mutation. And for the product mutation is going to derive from object graph type. Just like the product query, the mutation also derives from object graph type. And its method also would look exactly same, because underlying these are just incoming HTTP calls. So the implementation for both mutation as well as query is going to implement the base class object graph type. And here, just like the other one, we're going to create a constructor. And in the constructor, I'm going to inject the iProductCreator. I have to expose the interface, which I have not. So let me add the interface. Okay, now I can see the product creator, and let's create a variable. And then for create product, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a field, and the product is going to return the product. So for GraphQL, it's going to be the product type as the return. And then for the name, I'm going to name it as create product. That's the name. And the next thing, we want to pass the argument, because product creation has to get the entire product back. So for the arguments, we are going to say new of query arguments, just like before. And then here, and then here we're going to say new of query argument. And for this one, our argument is nothing but product input. So we are going to say product input as the argument, and then we'll just pass a name, and the name is going to be nothing but product. So that's our argument. And then next, just like before, we are going to have resolve. And for the resolve, what we are going to do is we're going to say it goes to product creator dot create, and for the create we need to pass the product parameter, and for that, just like the query, we are going to do x dot get argument, and for the argument type it's going to be product. As you know, this product input will be converted into product because they have the exact same properties. So we'll create a get argument of product, and the name is going to be the name that we passed here, which is product. Then close this and close this. That is essentially the implementation for the product mutation. Now what we are going to do is we are going to go back to the product, and here in the schema we need to expose the mutation. So for that, what we are going to do is we're going to say mutation equal to the same thing, but instead of product query, it's going to be product mutation. And now I'm going to go into the program, and I'm going to add the rest of the dependencies. So the first thing we are going to add is after data access, we have to add the product creator. The next thing we have to do is we have to add the product input. Okay, let's add the product mutation as we need that as well. And the last one is going to be product input. So we added the mutation, we added the input. Now we are all set. So let's run this application now. And now we should be able to add new product through the GraphQL UI as well as Postman. But I'm just going to show the UI because then we'll go ahead and we'll try to execute the client implementation. So now if I refresh the docs, I go back to home, I can see apart from product, we have the product mutation. Product mutation has this create product, which takes product as an input, which is this 3 field. So you can see the documentation is also updated. Now this query is going to work as expected. Now for mutation, let me create another query called mutation. And the mutation name I'm going to give as add. And here I will take the product parameter, which is going to be product input as the type. And as you can see, the mutation is also very similar to how query works. And then here we are going to say the name of the mutation is create product. So we're going to say create product, and its parameter is product, which is going to be $prod. And then in the return, we can have just the ID for the time being. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create here the product variable. And for product, we're going to have ID is equal to 5 and then name. And for the name, let's name it as headphone as the product. And for the quantity, let's say 50. And now I'll go and run this mutation. And I can see the product is created and we got 5 as the ID back. Now if I query all the product, I can see number 5 headphone is also added to the product list. So this is how mutation works. As you can see, it is very similar to how query works. And similar implementation will be if we want to add, delete, and update. It's not going to be very different. So I'm not going to spend any time on delete and update, at least for this video, because I'm going to focus on how to now use a .NET client to make queries into a GraphQL .NET service or any other GraphQL service for that matter. So for that, I created this project called GraphQL Client Demo. Right now it doesn't have anything. Let me get rid of this. And then in the NuGet package, I already added a couple of NuGet package. First one is the GraphQL.client. That's the one we need. And the second one we need is GraphQL.client.serializer.newtonsoft. Once we have these two, now we are ready to create a client. So for the client, first thing we need is we need the same product object because we are going to deserialize into the same product object. So let's go and create a class here and let's name it as model so that we can keep all the models here. Let me get rid of any of these because none of these are needed. And here we can have product. And then the other thing is we'll need a couple other models, but I'll come to that later. Next thing what we are going to do here is, first thing we are going to do is we're going to create var client equal to new HTTP client. So we are going to create the GraphQL HTTP client, and for that we have to add the namespace GraphQL.http. And then this takes the URL. So we are going to pass the URL. The URL is going to be this and then /GraphQL. So I'm going to get rid of the UI and altair. Instead of that, it will be GraphQL. If you remember my last video, this is the URL we used to connect from Postman. It's the same URL. So first parameter is the GraphQL. The next parameter is the serializer. So for serializer, we are going to use the Newtonsoft JSON serializer. And I'm going to add the namespace. So this is the client is now created. After the client is created, we have to create a request object. Now first we are going to show how query works. Then we're going to go into mutation. So for query, I'm going to create var query is equal to new, and we can use GraphQL request. I have to add the namespace GraphQL. And then for the GraphQL request, we have a parameter called query, and we are going to set it up. And for the query, we can pass the exact same query that we pass in the UI. So I can just copy this query and pass it here. And I can also add the quantity to it. So this is my query. And then I can do var response is equal to client dot send query async. Now here I'm going to add await and send query async. Here I need the response back, and then here I'll pass the query. Now for the response, we have to create a model, because if you remember, the response comes as products and then an array. So we have to create a response object for that. So for that, what we are going to do is we're going to create a products response. So we can create public record products response, which will have an array of products. That's all. And here now I can say product. We just copy paste this. I'll have to add the namespace for this as well. Okay. And here I want to print out all the products from the response. So for that I can do for each product is equal to response dot data dot products, which is going to give all the products. And then I can do console dot write line, and I can say product dot name comma product dot quantity. Let's just print this too. And now if I run this application, something did not work. Okay, I am missing the top level brackets for the query. Now let's run this. Now you can see that we got all the 5 products back: laptop, mouse, keyboard, monitor, and headphone. Now let's see how we can do the same thing with a single product. So I can again define a query here, and I'm going to keep this code as is, add new code, and I can say var query is equal to, and here I want to get a single product. So for that I'm going to copy this entire query, and this is what I'm going to use. So here, as you can see, I'm using the same query, and I'm saying first product where ID is an integer, and then I'm just using the ID and returning this. Now here what we have to do after we define the query, we have to define the operation name, because we have a name for the operation, and the name is nothing but this name. So we can say operation name equal to the first product, and then finally we have to pass the variable because this ID variable needs to be passed. So for that we can define variables, and this is just a dynamic parameter, so I can say new, and here for us it's just the ID, so I can say ID is equal to 2, which is the second item. And then after that I can create another var single response is equal to client.await, and I can say send query async, and this time I am expecting a product. And if you look into the response of this query, I have to ID. Okay, so if you look into the response of this query, it comes with the product. The data has a product object and the product itself. So for that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to model, and I'm going to create something here called product response. So public record, and I'm going to have here something called product response, which is just taking the product. So here when I do a send query, it is going to be nothing but product response. And I'm going to pass the same query, and then now this is a single response. So what I can do is I can do console.writeLine, and I can say single response dot data dot product. Let's try to print it out, and let's run this. So first we see the 5.1, and then we see the entire product object printed out. Product ID to name mouse quantity is 0. So quantity is not showing up because we are not getting the quantity as a part of this response. But if I add quantity here, we'll see quantity is equal to 20. So if I just add the quantity here and run this, we're going to see quantity is going to be equal to 30. Mouse quantity was 30. So quantity is 30 as expected. So you can see how easy it is to use the same query in a .NET client. And then the last thing we are going to try is how to do mutation. And it is going to be very similar. So first we are going to create a query. It's going to be like this. And we're going to copy paste this mutation logic from here and paste it here. We just do some indentation. Okay, and then for the operation, this time the operation name is add, and for the product here, it's actually an object of product input. So what we are going to do is we're going to say prod, because that's the name we are passing here. Prod is equal to new. We'll create another anonymous type. For the ID we're going to say 5, and then ID is 5, and then name is equal to, we can say speaker, and then quantity we can say as 60. So that's the variables. And then finally we can just say var mutation response is equal to client dot, and we can do the same thing. We can use the send mutation async, or we can call send query async. Send mutation async internally just calls send query async. I just went into their source code in GitHub and figured out it's pretty much the same. So I'm just going to use send query async. And now for the product response, before we are getting a product back, we need, if you look into the product response actually what's getting, if you look into the documentation, the product response is going to get a create product back. So we have to create a different object for that. So I'm going to go into models, and here I'm going to create a create product response. You just copy paste this and call it as create product response, and here the name of the parameter has to be create product, because that's the name of the response, and this is critical. that the name has to match the name of the actual response. So create product response, and then here we can say create product response, and then finally I can do the same thing. Just do a console.write of multiple response, and then we can go back and check and data.create a product. It's the response, and then we can go back and check in the UI. We can just run this query and we should see the speaker should be added to the response here. So let me run, and we can see the ID is 5, name and quantity is 0 and empty because we are not selecting any name and quantity. So that is expected. Now if we go back here and if we run the select, we can see ID is 5 and speaker is coming. If we add the quantity, we can see the quantity is also reflected here as 60. So as you can see, it is just like building GraphQL in .NET. Querying GraphQL from a .NET client is also extremely simple, and it's very easy to do it once you get a hang of it. In my next video, I'll try to cover using a GraphQL client in a HTML and JavaScript based application like Angular, and how we can use a .NET GraphQL service with an Angular application, and the Angular application calling out the GraphQL service. So that's all I wanted to cover for today's video. And if you want me to cover something else in GraphQL, please leave a comment below. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up. And if you are new to my channel, if you think you are getting value out of my channel, please subscribe to my channel. And thanks so much for watching this video.